With us today is Amy Jen Sue. She is the author most recently of the book, The Leader You Want to Be, 5 Essential Principles for Bringing Out Your Best Self Every Day. She's a fellow Harvard Business Review writer. She is the sort of founding and managing partner of Paravis Partners, and she's an executive coach. So what I really like doing in this podcast is getting as practical and real as possible. And so it's exciting to be speaking to someone who's on the ground with people like I am, working to help them make the kinds of changes that will help them to be more successful. So it's not a theoretical or conceptual conversation, it's a very practical one. Amy, welcome to the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Thanks, Peter, for having me. It's great to be here.
So why did you write The Leader You Want to Be?
You know, the leader you want to be is really part of a larger mission I've had as an executive coach in terms of the hope I have for myself and others to be who they're meant to be, make the impact they're meant to make, and do that without all the sacrifices and compromises that I think we all feel we make towards our health, our families, or even our integrity. And so this is just a continuation of work that I've been doing for almost 2 decades. And I think as I think about organizational life and how much more complex and fast it's gotten, it feels like the timing's right for a book like this.
So I'm going to sort of full disclosure here. I almost passed on this book because I looked at it and I looked at the title and it's like 5 essential things for bringing out your best self and, be the best leader you could possibly be. And it felt, I get probably 200 or 300 books a year for the podcast, and I read or at least look through most of them. And I was like, another book about being your best self, like not interested. And I didn't pass. Then I looked at it and I actually read more into it. And I'm so glad that I didn't pass on it because I actually think it's really great. And I love how practical it is. So I do sort of want to start out by asking you this question because I do think this be your best self and better this year better than last year, and I get exhausted just thinking about it, and I also wonder whether there's some destructiveness in constantly pursuing better, more perfect, no excuses, improve who you are today so you're better than you were yesterday. I think it gets tiring, and I wonder. So anyway, my question to you is, is it really important to bring our best self every day? And is there a downside to it?
It's such a fair question, Peter, honestly. And in a way, I hope this book reframes and redefines best self, if you will. I think in this case, in this book, best self is not trying to say the superhuman, Peter, you need to be Superman, or hey, Amy, you need to be Superwoman and be going 24/7 a day. And it's also not, hey, you can just take a pass and be reactive and be on autopilot and be a bunch of old habits and patterns. And so in this book, my hope is folks say, hey, who is the best self that's authentic, that is true to who you are, your principles and values? It's not easy because sometimes being conscious and present to say in this moment what is really the right thing to do can be challenging, but that's my hope, that it's less about striving for some perfection or yet another should, but instead to tap into a greater truth and a greater essence to who we want to be in the world.
So paint very briefly, if you can, this picture of these two leaders that you talk about in the book.
Sure. In the book, we characterize a leader A and a leader B. And in some ways, two modes we all find ourselves in, right? Leader A is that part of us. Sometimes you even wake up and know, wow, I'm holding a broad lens on the world today. I'm not taking things personally. Even when life throws a curveball, it feels like I can handle it with a little more ease and effectiveness. And then leader B lives within all of us too, right? Where we're more reactive, we're a little less effective, we're a little more burnt out. And so leader A and leader B, and the characterization of those two modes, if you will, we're meant to just have all leaders and professionals realize we're all going through the same thing and feeling the same tensions.
So one of these pitfalls, there's some pitfalls that lead us to becoming leader B, the sort of more reactive, tense leader, as opposed to the more expansive, maybe visionary leader. And and one of the pitfalls is, I'll just do more pitfall. And
Mm.
I found myself asking this question as I was reading the book also, because there was more things to do, right? When you're reading the book, it's kind of help you to get clearer on some things, which is actually more to do. So how does this not become one more thing to do that sort of conspires to send us down the I'll just do more pitfall?
Such a great question that I'll just do more, which is so pervasive in society and for all of us. And I think the key distinction is, are we just doing more for the sake of volume or a should, or are we just doing more of the value add and what we know really brings out our best self or makes us feel effective? There's usually a few things that we all already know, and then we lose touch with that. What are the two or three things that you, Peter, or I, Amy, do that we know, whether that's a good night's sleep or the way we say our yeses and nos, can make the difference between just doing more value add versus doing more volume.
Right. And you make this great point here that it's kind of a favorite point of mine, because I think it's our biggest challenge, which is we know so much more than we do. It's this gap between what we know and what we do. And what I talk a lot about is emotional courage, the willingness to feel things. We could actually close the gap between what we know and what we actually follow through on if we're willing to feel stuff. I'm wondering, and I think that, a lot of this book is about closing that gap. And I'm curious about your sense as to the emotional courage piece of it. Like, is it important? Can you kind of plan your way around it so that you don't have to be willing to feel things? And I'd love to get your perspective on that.
I think emotional courage, what a great term. And I love that you are bringing that out into the world and getting people to think about that. Because the more we turn off and we turn off those feelings, I think the more the autopilot kicks in, right? So I always say to clients, hey, permission to feel what you feel. I actually want you to get present to whether that's joy and happiness as much as getting present to maybe frustration or anger or sadness. But the key is, how do you not let those emotions run you or to become those emotions, but rather just to experience them, let them inform you, and then say, okay, given my principles and my values and how I want to engage with my colleagues or my work, then how am I going to choose to show up? But without the truth of the feelings, it's almost impossible to really proceed with choice and real action.
Right. Yeah, and you actually have some really great in the book, some of these real action points, right? Which says, like, here, like, when you're in that place where you can take action, here's some actions that you should take. By the way, I fall into all your pitfalls. Not really the I'll do it later pitfall, which just reinforces my I'll just do it now pitfall. Like, you have the I'll just do more pitfall. I'll just do it now. I'll just do it myself, and then I'll just do it later. And I imagine that most people who fall into the I'll just do it now pitfall tend not to fall into the I'll just do it later pitfall, or vice versa. But I keep myself sort of more busy than I would need to, and your I can't remember now whether this was in the four quadrants, whether that was in the purpose or in the process section of your book. You probably remember, although having done a lot of these interviews, I know people ask me questions about my books, and sometimes I don't remember. But do you remember if your four quadrants are in the purpose and process?
Yeah, they're actually in both. So they're introduced in the purpose chapter. Yeah.
Great. So when I first, again, and I'm just sort of telling you what my experiences were, and I'm sharing this with listeners too, because I think it's worth getting over these elements of resistance that I certainly felt, because I think there's real value in this. I saw a 4-quadrant model, having spent many years in consulting and, now coaching and consulting and advising for, 20 years. I'm like, another 4-quadrant model. And in fact, I have found myself, like, I went back to it and I drew out the 4 quadrants and I started listing things. And then I had a conversation with my own assistant about, her view and what are things that should be in her for. So I would love for you to take us through your 4-quadrant model and kind of what fits into each quadrant relatively briefly so that we can kind of get into the meat of it. But I think it's a very useful way of thinking about where we should be spending our time and where we should not.
Great. The four quadrants, the purpose quadrants, as found in the purpose chapter, if you could imagine drawing an x-axis, which is your contribution. What's the difference you want to make? What are your highest value add projects? So, for all the listeners out there, if you think about your tasks, your projects and initiatives, if I were to ask you directly, which ones are your highest and best use? Or if I were to ask your boss or your board or your colleagues, what would they say?
Well, and let's actually do this so that it could be real. So there's at the top of the quadrant is contribution, and the left box is low contribution, and the right box is high contribution. The right column, the left column is low contribution, the right column is high contribution, and then the y-axis is passion. Right? And
yes.
And the top row is high passion, and the bottom row is low passion.
That's right. Yes.
So if I'm in the top right quadrant, I'm in high passion and high contribution.
Yes, and that is the sweet spot, right? Most people will tell you they feel like their best self, they're in flow, they're highly effective, engaged, when you are both making a difference and feeling that high sense of passion and energy.
Great. And then down below, I'm contributing. This is what you call tolerate. It's quadrant 2. I'm contributing, but I'm not particularly passionate about it. It doesn't jazz me. It doesn't do anything for me, but it's probably important for me to contribute.
Yes. These are the places where many times your colleagues or 360 will yield where you should be focused and what folks hope you work on, and it's value add, but perhaps you've gotten bored of it. Mm-hmm. Or it was never your favorite thing to do, and there's some part of everybody's job that falls in this tolerate bucket.
Right. And then you have quadrant 3, which is the upper left quadrant, which is low contribution but high passion. And you talk about elevating here. Talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So we all have those places where we love what we're doing, but the contribution and value add's a little unclear. And so either the guidance is to elevate yourself, where maybe, it's something you love to do from a previous role, but it's really time to let it go and give it to a direct report or somebody on your team. Or it's, hey, maybe you're seeing something that you're excited about and you need to socialize the idea and make sure you elevate the idea to other stakeholders.
Got it. And then quadrant 4, which is low contribution and low passion. You say basically you don't like it, you're not contributing to it, there's no reason you should be doing it.
Yes, try to eliminate. That's the eliminate box.
Right. So now so let's play with this. And actually, let's use me as an example, because why not? Because we're talking. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into my high contribution and high passion quadrant. And I think probably a lot of entrepreneurs would feel the same way, right? Because I started the company, I run the company, in many ways, I'm the thought leadership of the company. And so, I'm working with clients, I'm writing, I'm coaching, I'm speaking, I'm teaching, all about leadership. I'm sort of and I've had conversations with clients about this, when I've been on television or when I've shot video, I'm in the role of talent, right? Yes. Like what the production companies or what the film industry calls talent versus the production side. Right. Now, as an entrepreneur, I kind of do both, right? Because I'm running the company, but I would much rather just be in talent. Like I'd much rather someone else run this company and someone else do all the marketing and someone else, write the proposals. And I just write, coach, speak, and teach about leadership and create thought leadership around that. So that's what I want to do. So my high contribution, high priority, high passion is in thinking about and spreading the word about and supporting other people in becoming better, stronger leaders.
Right.
Okay. So that's there. Now, if you go down to tolerate, there's like a ton of stuff, right? It feels like my tolerate is huge because I have to design ultimately marketing all comes down to me. It's Bregman Partners, right? You have the same thing with Paravis Partners, right? So the marketing and the proposals, if I'm going to actually teach or consult or coach around the stuff, then I probably have to be the one to write the proposal because I'm designing the thing. And my question is, for people like us, how do we not spend our lives in toleration?
Right. Yeah, it's such a classic problem, and I was feeling it viscerally in my own body as you were describing it in terms of my own life. I think number one, the awareness of the distinction between the activities that put you in that quadrant one versus the tolerate box. And then to really look hard at that tolerate box and say, what portions of an activity could I continue to build a team around me? So the second principle in the book is about your operating system, and this is where the purpose quadrants and your operating system really need to go hand in hand. So for example, my assistant color codes my calendar against these 4 quadrants, and she knows that there's only so much of the tolerate color that I can tolerate on any given day.
Right.
So very strategic about threading that through the week in a way that I don't lose energy. And more have had to supplement folks on our team or outsource to folks who can take pieces that relieve me from the tolerate box as often as possible.
Got it. So I have a new assistant, and she started about a week ago. And as soon as I sort of read this, I was like, okay, I want you to read these 2 chapters. At least, you can read the whole thing because it's a great book, but read Purpose and Process, and then let's talk about it. And so I might actually ask you the favor. I'm cornering you a little bit because I'm asking you on the podcast. But if our EAs can have a conversation, because I bet my EA could learn a lot from how you and your EA are working together, and maybe the 4 of us could have a conversation.
Absolutely, we'd be happy to, and I'm sure we would get ideas too. So it would be a great group brainstorm for sure.
That would be really fun.
Yeah.
And because already it's like, even in a basic thing, it's like, okay, so how do you color code in Google Calendar? But you probably already know how to do that. So we'll talk about all that stuff. So then it comes to the elevate, and this is, things that are low contribution and high passion. Yeah. And I couldn't find anything to go in that box, and I'm curious about that. So I found things like, I kind of make my own travel arrangements, and I don't know, is that a passion or is that just like an OCD control thing? I travel so much, so I kind of if that hotel's not available, I know what other hotel I want, or if I know where I want to sit on the plane. If that so I'm making all these micro decisions that are absolutely not a good use of my time. There's no question that it's a good use of my time,
right.
And yet I find myself doing it. And so does that go into that quad? Does that mean that that's a passion, even though I would hate to think, because I don't actually think it's a passion to do my own travel, and yet I find myself gravitating towards it. Or here's another example with finances. It's my company, right? And so I'm pretty close to the finances, and that feels like maybe that's high contribution, but I don't actually know that that's high contribution. I don't know that I'm contributing so much, but I might just be controlling, or I might not want to lose control of the thing that I think, can make or break a company. And so I might just not be trusting enough so I'm curious about those 2 examples. They don't feel like passions to me. I would love to have nothing to do with our finances. And yet I still find myself doing it, and I don't know that it doesn't belong in this quadrant of delegate, hire, or eliminate, but I'm a little afraid of getting too far from it. So cure me.
Yeah, so for sure those are activities that feel like to the left side, right? The left column of the 2 quadrants for sure.
Right.
And it does, for many of us, we tend to hold on to those things out of control. It can feel really good. It's low-hanging fruit. It's things that tie to our preferences. But that's a place, for example, Peter, if we were to have a conversation with our EAs, that would be a perfect thing for your EA to come to know, or for anyone's EA to come to know, so that really your time and energy is focused on things like this podcast, or when you're out in the world writing and spreading your message. The world needs more of that than for you to, obviously do your own travel plan. So it's great for, I think, all professionals just to notice where are the places we are holding on to something because of control, and not because it's actually a high passion or necessarily a high contribution.
Right.
It's a great place to get help.
Okay, great. So that really, all of those things, both. Go ahead. Sorry, tie it back.
No, I was going to say, tying back to emotional courage, right? Letting go of control does require some vulnerability from all of us.
Right.
And some patience that it may not happen right away in the way that we want it to.
I hate when people use my own methodology against me. No, but that's true. That's 100% true. That's hard. So let's say those things belong in that quadrant of delegate, right? Delegate, hire, or eliminate, right? And I can't eliminate it, so that's delegated. And what then fits into, like, what are some examples of things that fit into high passion, low contribution?
So I have a lot of clients who, especially when they take on a new role, uh, still love to do things like, for example, fix or solve certain problems that really now are meant to empower their teams to do, so that they can go on and take on the bigger role that they're in. So, for example, I had a CEO who had originally been more of a COO type role out in the field. And when he became CEO, the board said to him, you now need to find like 40 days back in the office instead of all the traveling that you used to do. And this is somebody who really loved being out with customers and out with the field. And we literally painstakingly went through his calendar and found 40 days. And a lot of them were conferences and board work and other things he really enjoyed, but he realized weren't truly in the mandate for his first year as CEO.
So you're making actually an interesting point, because you could argue for any CEO, there's a very high contribution to them being out there in the world and meeting with customers and being at conferences. Like, it would be hard to argue that he's not contributing. Yes. But I think what you're saying is, looking at the whole picture, where is the highest and best use of contribution for this person? And it's like, it's not just a question of high, because you could put all of those things in high contribution, high passion. Yes. But you're saying,
we parse it a little thinner, where the really top strategic customers we kept on his list.
Right.
Unfortunately, it was sort of a big segmentation to then figure out now, how did he let other people get a chance for visibility while keeping his visibility in the truest, highest places.
Right. When you're CEO, everything is high contribution.
Yes.
And so you really have to prioritize. And actually, you call quadrant one prioritize. You really have to prioritize, given limited time, limited resources, what is the highest contribution that needs to go in that box? Everything else needs to go in other boxes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I love that. Thank you. And so once we have purpose clear and we have a sense as to, okay, these are things I need to offload, these are things I need to spend a lot of my time on, you go into process, daily practices. And so I find that really important, and we could bring, EAs into the conversation, or, other people who work with us, because when we're doing something that's more than just one person, and most of us, are doing things that are more than just one person, or should be, because if we're not, then it means that we're not making the highest and best use of, our talent. Give us some advice about how to take what we've just been talking about and proceduralize it. I don't even know if that's a word, but to bring it into a process that allows us to be effective.
Process and purpose, as you mentioned, go hand in hand, right? You could have the best 2x2 quadrants all plotted, but if it's not operationalized into your calendar and the way you run your daily practices, you won't get very far. So for sure, first step, looking at the calendar, as I mentioned, color coding against those quadrants so that you can get a quick snapshot. At any moment being able to pull that up and say, wow, are my colors trending towards that upper right-hand quadrant or not? And then down to the micro level of, hey, Peter, when are your power hours? When do you feel the most clarity of thinking and energy? And let's make sure all those Q1 activities mostly fall into that protected time. So the chapter goes into a lot of just basic blocking and tackling and good habits.
And it's both increasing your awareness, right, with the color coding, and then really thinking about your own energy and your own schedule, and how to maximize your ability to bring your passion and contribution to the activities that need it the most.
Absolutely.
Great. How do we find a productive balance between structure and spontaneity? Because you could go through this whole process and everything is super structured, and yet there's a spontaneous element that is probably important, or maybe you would say it's not as important, but I'm curious to get your thoughts around it.
I think the word awareness that you said previously is the number one key, right? So we all fall differently on the continuum of love of spontaneity versus structure. So if you're a more high structure person, like really honor that and go to town. I would say for folks who desire more spontaneity and are more emergent in their style, as you go through that chapter, tread lightly, pick one or two things that give you freedom, so I think for folks who spontaneity is very important, and I think play for all of us is. Part of building in structure for busy people is actually looking for, unstructured time, if you will.
Right. Time where you're cordoning it off to be spontaneous. Right. You can be spontaneous between 2 and 3 this afternoon.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You talk about purpose, process, and then people. And in the people, it's really about bringing out the best in your people and also kind of matching the right people to the right work. So what I'm curious about is, what do you do when you have someone who's great at a particular skill or talent? Like they're just, like you brought them in to do X and they're really, really great at it. But their communication or their detail orientation or other elements are not up to snuff. And you do some stuff in order to address it. But, they're really great at the stuff that you hired them for, but this other stuff is really getting in the way. Do you and attempts to remediate haven't been so successful? How would you approach that?
Those are really tough situations, right? When folks are meeting one need in their role but not getting the whole role. And I think that happens a lot now, especially in high growth businesses where people wake up and while they have the same title, the job just got bigger.
Yeah.
So I think everything you named there would be what I would suggest. Step one, letting the person know that you have an aspiration for them to be more effective and to rise to the occasion, and then providing that support and that coaching to see if they can grow in those ways. But I do think there's a point where for every leader and professional or team leader where you say, wow, even with our best efforts, the person just hasn't traveled far enough on that particular dimension to do that role well. And one thing that comes to mind is there's a great YouTube video of Jeff Warner from LinkedIn talking about compassionate leadership, and that leaving somebody in a role where they're just not performing actually is not compassionate.
Right.
So I think at that point,
what gets tough is if they are performing and they're not performing, right? It's not like they're just not performing. It's like they're actually performing, but they're also not performing.
Right.
Because because there's different areas of the job that require different things. But maybe I guess what you're saying is, truthfully, that's not performing. Like the answer is, half performing or performing in some stuff and not others. It like people are whole package, and there's probably someone who would be a better fit for the role in that way, is what you're saying.
Right. I think that's the assessment that would need to be made, right? Is there a way to reduce this person's scope just to what they're good with and make sure their title and comp are commiserate with that? Or is it that truly you now as a manager are taking on some of that underperformance, if you will, and compensating for somebody, which then limits your own time? Or is it actually hurting the morale of the rest of the team?
Right.
Seeing that, I think then you may have a tougher decision to make.
Yeah, and maybe there's ways of hiring someone to do the stuff that they can't do or don't do well, or maybe it's not a right fit. I don't know the answer either. But those are good ways of thinking about it. All right, quick in terms of presence. I have one particular question with you around that, and it's also personal, which is I find when you talk about presence, you talk about the ability to show up the way you want to show up with intention. And also I talk a lot about intention versus impact, right? Which is you could have the best of intentions, but your impact might be off. So you have to really be aware of kind of what your impact, what you want your impact to be, and then do what you need to do to have that impact. So here's what I notice about myself from a presence perspective. I am really good at doing things, and I'm much less good at not doing things. So I have a predisposition towards action. And let me give you I'm going to give you this super simple example that's not even work related, which is I exercise every single day. Not a problem. I'm not going to miss a day exercising. So I'm going to work out. That's an active thing to do to be fit.
Yeah.
But not eating things that I shouldn't eat is much harder for me. So
Right.
it's like it should be the easiest thing in the world because actually exercise requires time and energy and effort and planning and all this stuff. Not eating stuff I shouldn't eat requires nothing, right? I
Right.
mean, it requires
Yes.
nothing, but just it saves me time and it saves me energy. And yet I'm much worse at it. Give me some advice.
That's a great question. I'm smiling here because I think I'm the opposite. So I probably could use some advice back where exercise feels like it's the hardest thing. So I think in a world, number one, of where between sleep, diet, and exercise, if we get some of that right, so number one, I would say take a victory lap for that. The predisposition towards action keeps you healthy and keeps you moving.
Right.
And then the question is on the eating front, from the when you find yourself reaching for the candy bar versus the apple, is that just default, or is that a signal or a cue? I know for me, when I start to reach for the chips or the candy, there's usually an underlying feeling
I'm
that I'm not as
tired
big, or
or
I'm
I'm whatever. Right.
tired or
Right.
something else.
Right.
So from in the book, in that particular chapter, there's some research that actually came out of a great HBR article about if-thens. So I guess my advice would be the next time you find yourself reaching for something, hey, if Peter is what, then you tend to reach for not good food. Sort
Then
of how do
change
you
the
want to
trigger.
reframe this?
If that trigger happens, give me a different behavior that it triggers onto.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
One last question, because I want to touch each of these, although you have a lot more information in the book. Your fifth is peace, so it's purpose, process, people, presence, and peace. And you talk a lot about acceptance and gratitude and rather than striving and ego protection. And I find it conceptually appealing and easy to understand and candy to the Zen in me. But on the other hand, I also feel like, look, I've achieved a lot. I've written a lot of books. I've contributed to a lot of books. And yet I still feel the survivor mentality. I still feel this mentality that has actually served me really well in my success, which is the opposite of peace. It's like I got to keep running and I got to keep producing and I got to keep creating and I got to make something of myself. And like we could go into all of the psychology of it, but I'm curious how you take this advice of, letting go and apply it when there's strong psychological need in people that drives them to do what they do, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing what they do. How do you help people bridge that gap?
I think the answer to that question is, the point of diminishing returns. So I think there is a level of inner dissatisfaction, desire for innovation, the inner part of ourselves that want to keep producing and achieving and expanding. And to your point, there's a real high functioning, high benefit part of that. And so I would say keep what's working for you that keeps you productive. And then my question would be, do you personally have a tipping point where, wow, it starts to really impact your health or your relationships or other commitments that are important to you? And where's that fine line between, a healthy paranoia and hunger that keeps all of us motivated? And when does that become not productive or effective, or when we get in our own way?
So I could identify that point, but identifying it and following through on shifting it are two very different things. It's sort of like maybe the answer is emotional courage. I mean, that's always my answer, but
Yes.
it's like it might be the same thing as letting go of my admin, travel, and finances, right? Which is like there's still a nagging need or drive to be more better. I mean, that's probably why I react to like your best self kind of thing. It's like,
Right.
when is it enough?
Yes.
And I think part of at least my answer to it is there's not an easy answer to it. You have to be willing to feel the vulnerability of not being enough in order to sit with who you are in that moment and not keep striving for some moments. And when that happens, you can't convince yourself that you're enough. You just have to sit with the, emotional experience of not feeling enough and yet not really doing anything to change that. And maybe over time, then that changes, but maybe it doesn't.
Right. But I think your point on getting present to those moments where we don't feel like we're enough, right? And just the sheer experience of that courage to get present to it, I think begins to create an alchemy towards that set of feelings,
Right.
To say, hey, we are enough, right? And I have many leaders who are at real pinnacles in their careers where the conversation now is, wow, permission to just for a moment taste some satisfaction that you've arrived, and that now you can begin to have fun and say, what would it mean to optimize for joy and for passion
Right.
and for contribution and something different?
Well, we're going to experiment with this because this evening
Yeah.
I'm leaving on vacation with my wife, and I just set out my email out of office message, and it says, and this tells you about how ineffectively I've done this in the past, I will be without access to email for the next week, and then in parentheses I write for real this time, because because I've tried it before and it doesn't really work. But I'm really going to sort of cut the cord and see what I experience over the next week with just Eleanor. We've been talking with Amy Jen Sue. Her book is The Leader You Want to Be: 5 Essential Principles for Bringing Out Your Best Self Every Day. Amy, it's been really lovely speaking with you. Thank you so much for being on the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Likewise, Peter, thanks for having me.